I'm Humbo, and today we're going to be talking about process counterplans. So first, let's go over some agenda. First, we're going to talk about what exactly is process. Two, we're going to learn about how to debate process counterplans on the neg. And three, we're going to talk about how to answer process counterplans on the affirmative. And four, we're going to touch a little bit upon competition, which is a very complex topic that someone else is going to do a lecture on later. First, what is a process counterplan? Well, it is literally a normal counterplan that results in the affirmative. I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but the counterplan competes off of changing the process of the plan. Now, this is kind of cheaty in itself, you can argue that, but sometimes when you're hitting a new affirmative that you just have absolutely no idea what's going on with, you'll have to work with what you can. If you can't really debate case, this is one of the off cases that you have to go to if you really can't contest with the solvency of the plan. First, what does that really look like? Well, let's have two examples. In the first example, imagine the affirmative generate more revenue to a corporation, and a process counterplan to that will be to generate revenue to a corporation through increasing additional fees. So you see, we're changing the process of how to generate more revenues to a corporation, but we're not necessarily changing the affirmative, which is to generate corporations. Next, the second example is more topic pertaining. It's building more military infrastructure in the Arctic, and a process counterplan to that will be to build more military infrastructure through a public-private partnership program, which is when the government and the corporations work together to build this program, which is, you can argue, something that the government not usually do when they try to implement any policies. Now, before we get down to the nitty-gritties of process counterplans, you have to understand two key jargons: fiat and normal means. So fiat means to literally mandate the affirmative in an action, but it doesn't specify the methodology. So if you look at plan text of many of these affirmatives that have been put out in the past few years, you'll see that most of them actually just say the USFG should do this. It never actually says the USFG should do this through something else which specifies the methodology. And that's the concept of fiat. We wish the affirmative policy into place. We literally mandate and believe that it's going to be implemented, but you don't specify what the methodology is. However, you still can, and we call that normal means, which is the most common and normal way affirmative will be implemented. So for example, if a government were to pass a policy, in policy debate we'll just fiat that policy into happening, but then you can also argue normal means, which is the most normal way the government is going to implement that policy in real world. So what's different between a process counterplan and a normal counterplan? Well, process counterplans argue implementation of a process that is separate from the normal means. So for example, if my process were to, as going back to the previous example, to earn more money through let's just say taxation, but then in this case, we're earning more money through raising the money through donations. And that is going to be a change in a process, and thus a process counterplan is born. And two, its opportunity cost is missing out on the process, not the affirmative that will end up. So that's different than a normal counterplan, because your opportunity cost is which process are we going to do to achieve the affirmative, and not what we're doing with the affirmative. Three, process counterplans only quote fiat the process. It argues that the affirmative is the result of the process. So a process counterplan fiats the process of the plan and argues that it results in the plan, as opposed to a normal counterplan which fiats the entire mandate of the counterplan, kind of like affirmative policy. So the last part of a process counterplan is a net benefit. A net benefit, if you don't know already, is the opportunity cost of the counterplan to the plan in the form of a disadvantage with an internal link or impact. A process counterplan can have internal and external net benefits. So for an internal net benefit, it's a net benefit that can only be remedied through the process of the counterplan. So in other words, this net benefit cannot be avoided by any other means of the plan or any other means other than the process of the counterplan, which makes it unique to the counterplan. First, we have an example of PPP counterplan, which is essentially a public-private partnership counterplan that the net benefit is public-private partnership in military, which checks ex-military factor risk of war hawk behaviors. Second is the Canada counterplan, which the net benefit is Canada's multilateral power structure collapsing, which can lead to a rising and escalating Arctic war and war in rest of the large global domains where a middle power is necessary to maintain balance. And next is the external net benefit. An external net benefit is literally a separate off in the form of a disadvantage that can be avoided through the counterplan itself. So for example, if you change the process of the plan, like if we're not going through a certain branch of the government, we can avoid the politics disad. And so, which means that we won't have to deal anything with PC or even talk about anything with politics because we avoid using the Congress. And second, we can also avoid trade-off disads, which our counterplan and our counterplan avoids using the branch that needs the PC elsewhere, so that we can essentially garner this net benefit and then avoid linking to it in the first place. Now, let's look at an example. If you go on to the descriptions below, we've attached a file called the Sunset Counterplan. So the plain text of the counterplan is this. The United States federal government ought to blah blah blah, subject to judicially imposed sunset that requires review with the possibility of renewal, alteration, or termination every 25 years. If you take a look at this counterplan essentially does not change any part of the affirmative policy because you copy paste in the mandate of the plan. But it does change one thing. It fiats that the United States federal government, subject to a judicially imposed sunset that requires review, that renews the plan, terminates it, and then alters or renews it every 25 years. And you can see the net benefit there. You can see the solvency advocate in the file as well. Now, let's talk about how to go for it on the net. Here's what the 1 and C structure will look like. You have the sunset counterplan 1 and C, so you know exactly what it should look like. You have a counterplan text at the top. You have to replace bracket X with the mandate of the plan, depending on which plan you are going up against. You have a solvency advocate. You have a net benefit in terms of the internal link and impact, and it's usually about 2 to 3 cards long. Here's what you should go for in a 2 and C. So first, you of course need an overview at the top, and then there will be future counterplan lectures on exactly what a counterplan overview will look like, including judge kick, sufficiency, all those good stuff. Next, in the 2 and C, you have to answer all of the permutations. Some of the most common ones are perm do both, perm do counterplan, and perm other issues. Of course, teams can make up other stupid kind of perms with every little tricks that they're gonna go for. For example, some form of delay perm, some form of permutation that picks out of half of the resolution, or some stupid perms like that you just have to deal with the tricks. And next, you have to answer solvency deficits. This is probably one of the most important parts on this slide because process solvency deficits are different since you are usually debating about the plan. And so with generic deficits, it will be usually predicated off of the words should or resolved, which means, as the affirmative will argue, certain or immediate. And the affirmative policy not being certain or not being immediate will lead to some sort of solvency deficit that only the counterplan links to, because fiat is definitely certain. So for counterplans, for other forms of counterplans, it could also be like an agent say no if you're going through like an agent who is overseeing the process. And then, of course, on the net benefit, you have to answer the turns and you have to answer impact defense that has been read, or else you'll be generating no real reason to prefer the counterplan over the plan. And lastly, in the 2-1R, similar to the 2-1C, you have to answer every argument on solvency and the net benefit, and that's usually normal and just extensions, you know, all that good stuff from the disadvantage lecture. Now, permutations are harder. perm do both should be a pretty similar answer to the 2-1C with much more extrapolation. Perm do the counterplan requires pretty in-depth competition debates about the words should, or the words United States federal government, or maybe other parts of the plan text. And lastly, perm other issues is the most, let's say, intricate one, because it is essentially a theory debate. And then if we want to go more into that, someone will do a lecture on competition later that's going to explain exactly what the 2-1R should be going for and what every single arguments mean. And the most important part in the 2-1R is when you go for a process counterplan, do not go to case. If you go to case, that is a waste of your time, and then you literally achieve nothing because you result in solving the case anyways because you pass the affirmative policy. And this means that you get 5 minutes on the counterplan to capitalize off of 1AR mistakes, which is very good, since the 1AR will usually probably only have 1 minute to 1.5 minutes to answer all of your 2-1C arguments, which means that they're bound to drop something important. And since you have 5 minutes to capitalize off of that, your win rate's pretty high, and thus the process counterplan is pretty strategic. And after talking about that, I know you're pretty confused, so let's take a quick break. Here's a picture of Justin in the Michigan alleyway. Here's a meme about Chaewon. Here's another meme about Chaewon. You can probably tell who's my favorite on this slide. Okay, now let's move on to the second half of the lecture. Right now, we'll be talking about affirmative answers to all of the negative extensions that I've talked about previously on a process counterplan. First, what is a 2AC construction going to look like? On an off note, some people will put certainty deficits and or immediacy deficits in the 1AC so that they can extend that into 2AC and have more evidence, but that will be covered here regardless. First, let's start off with the generics. Don't forget your permutations. Perm do both, perm do counterplan, perm other issues, and all those stupid perms that you can do tricks off of. You should have all of those in your 2AC. And also, remember, on perm other issues, you have to send out perm text or else it's illegitimate. You have the generic certainty immediacy deficit, which I have mentioned you can have in the 1AC. You should have a quote-unquote say no deficit, which is an agent saying no. And then you should have impact defense to an internal net benefit. And then you should also be trying to impact turn the net benefit so that you can garner some sort of advantage for your plan. And if you have extensive prep, like if you're in a big school, you might have specific permutations to specific processes that work best and is pretty much unbeatable to it, but that requires extra prep. And also, you might have specific deficits of the process, which is going to be extremely good because the negative team usually doesn't have the most amount of cards on upholding the process of the counterplan. Now, what can the 1AR do? Well, the 1AR is usually very time pressed, so you should extend about 2 to 3 key 2AC positions. Usually, I would go for a permutation, a solvency deficit, and or turning the net benefit, because that can allow the most strategic ground for the 2AR to capitalize off of. However, you got to keep this in mind. Solvency deficit 1ARs are literally the most aura. The most aura 1ARs always gives ground for the best 2AR, and nobody wants to watch a boring competition debate in the 2AR. So, of course, solvency deficits always gives you extra speaker points. Now, let's end on competition. Of course, this is for beginners because there will be a lecture later on exactly every single intricate steps of competition. So first, what is competition? Competition is testing whether a counterplan is an equal opportunity cost to the F. If you don't know what an opportunity cost is, it's an economics term that means the cost of the other alternative at the selection of an alternative. So for example, if I went to eat In-N-Out today, I'm losing on the opportunity cost of eating McDonald's at that exact same time period, and thus that categorizes itself as an opportunity cost because I'm losing out one alternative at the expense of the other. In other words, competition is testing whether the counterplan and the plan could be done together in some form in the world. So, There are two major types of competition: functional competition and textual competition. Competition is defined of how the counterplan garners the net benefit. It is not solely about whether or not the plan and the counterplan can be done together. That's the broad definition. How we define them is based off of how the counterplan itself garners the net benefit, which is how it avoids the net benefit either functionally or textually. First, on functional competition, we remove a function of the plan which changes the outcomes of the world, sans that function, and garners the net benefit through that outcome change. So, what do all these jumbled up words mean? So, for example, if the plan itself is to, let's say, build military infrastructures and deploy domain awareness, and the process counterplan changes the outcome of the world. So, a functional competition would be like if I pass a counterplan that only builds military infrastructure. We're changing the outcome of the world because there's no more domain awareness that's being built in the Arctic. And if my net benefit is garnered through not building domain awareness, then that counterplan is functionally competitive. Next, textual competition is removing words from the plan text and garnering the net benefit off that removal. So for example, if the plan text that I have includes the words that the United States federal government should, and I remove the words the United States federal government should, I garner the net benefit of, like, let's just say the politics stat off of it, then that's textually competitive because I'm garnering the net benefit through removing the words the United States federal government from the plan text. Well, that's everything for process counterplans. Welcome back to another Resolve Debate episode, and we hope to hear more from you in the future. You can use the attached file below with a sound sunset counterplan, or you can go on open case lists, find more on there, or use put out camp files and try to go for a 2NR of process.